It's my contention that we've lost a lot of what the Christian imagination is, because the imagination is such a powerful tool that we have at our disposal. And I think that Lewis, as you mentioned, already had tapped into that in a way that not too many authors have. Have we lost the idea of a Christian imagination in our contemporary culture, that we've been bombarded with images and we're just so caught up in having the entertainment done to us that we've really lost our ability to imagine? Or are all the images that we have in front of us indicative of imaginations that are becoming more awake?
I don't know exactly. I know I've done work on Lewis and the imagination. You talked about the Brotherhood of the Briar and that Pipes group that meets at
Mhm.
my house for discussion. And there was a guy at that group named Mark Neal, and Mark had written a couple of really good articles on Lewis. And in my study of Lewis, I found that he writes about the imagination at least 31 different ways. They say Eskimos
Wow.
live in snow 24/7 have 30 words for snow
Mhm.
because they can nuance it better. And Lewis, I think, who lived in the imagination, had all these words. So I said to Mark, you and I need to do a book on this. So we wrote a book called The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. We're going to do 31 descriptors on these different imagination. The publisher gave good advice. They said, no, just do 15, but show how Lewis works it out in one of his books. And I think that was a good editorial comment. So we did, with the appendix then giving the other ones that we didn't describe. But the fact that he looks at this in such nuanced ways, and all things human are fallen. So there could be broken ways that the imagination is used that are not for our good. And Lewis talks about those too. But most of them are helpful. And he'll talk about the fact that, he borrows a lot of these from different authors, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge talked about primary imagination or common sense. You
Mm.
have 5 gates of empirical data coming in: touch, sight, smell, taste, and hearing. And all that stuff is coming in all the time. And it's just a cacophony of information. But something makes sense out of them: primary imagination or common sense. And that's itself not an empirical activity. It's an activity of the imagination. You have bad uses of the imagination, what Lewis calls transforming imagination. It's basically psychological projection. It doesn't make any difference what the thing is. I project on it what I need it to be because I want to sustain myself in this sort of acrasia.
Mm.
But you also have what he calls from Shakespeare, the penetrating imagination. He writes an essay, Variation in Shakespeare. Penetrating imagination seeks to go deeper into a thing. He says Shakespeare can, in one sonnet, maybe have 7 metaphors. He's just getting all around the thing, showing the nuance and the complexity. And he writes another piece called Similes in Dante, where Dante does something similar. But then he talks about the realizing imagination that he thought was a medieval form. And it's like the thing in bud that opens up to a wider flower. And the
Mm.
realizing imagination takes it out wider. He talks about the great thing about um, medieval stories is that they embellish the old things that came to them. So you take Homer's embellished by Virgil, Virgil's embellished by Boccaccio and the Decameron. Chaucer takes Boccaccio and embellishes it and Troilus and Cressida. We do it today, but we're probably not as aware of it because we're not aware of the old material. But you take
Mm.
a story like a West Side Story, it's Romeo and Juliet retold. You take August Rush, and it's basically Oliver Twist retold. The Robin Williams character is the Fagin character. You take Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's the Odyssey retold. You take Lion King, it's basically Hamlet retold. You take Bridget Jones' Diary, it's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice retold. Colin Firth plays Darcy, a character named Darcy in
Mhm.
both stories, in the BBC edition and the Bridget Jones thing. It's like the director's taking a 2x4 and hitting the reader or the
Mm.
watcher over the head by saying, I'm just retelling I'm just retelling Jane Austen here in case you don't get it. I've got Colin Firth playing a guy by the same name in both stories. We're embellishing stories all the time. That's the realizing imagination.
Mm.
You've got others too, the material imagination. You've got a host of others are very, very interesting. And as we study these things and see how Lewis nuances these things so well, then it draws us in. And it draws us in this way. Any development in thought will require some use of the imagination. A scientist begins a scientific method with a hypothesis. It's not a thing, it's an imagined thing. And then they test the hypothesis. And if they discover something, they depict what they've discovered in models. That's not the thing itself, but it's an imaginative depiction of the thing. Mm-hmm. Even theology develops along those lines as well. All theology, Walter Elwell, the theologian, used to say, all theology is approximation. And we always seek better and better approximations. You look at the history of the church. We've got the first council in Acts 15. Mm-hmm. And we see a model there. If the church wants to solve a controversy, let's get together and get more eyes on the thing if we can. But then during the Roman persecution, you had a lot of heresies that were developing. So now let's solve these things. What are we going to do? Is Jesus really God? So they met at Nicaea. It was interesting. I was just at Nicaea about 3 weeks ago. Just a fairly nondescript place, but something that still is rippling through church history happened at that place. They got together and they formed a Trinitarian understanding of biblical revelation captured in theological doctrine. But it wasn't enough because the controversy still went on. Okay, if Jesus is God, how do we reconcile the two natures of Christ, his human and his divine? So they have the Council of Constantinople in 381. They have the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And it's through this imaginative development, even of theological doctrine, to try to understand this stuff. We imagine something, then we go back to the scriptures to see if what we've imagined has merit or not. Mm-hmm. And Lewis is not afraid to do that. And consequently, then, his faith is not static and inert. It's dynamic, and it's dynamic and orthodox. So it stays rooted in scripture, but it's developing in its application and understanding. It's wonderful.